Today, I'm joined by BNY Senior Client Strategist and former Navy and Blue Angel pilot, CJ Simonsen, to discuss the movie Top Gun Maverick. With the sound of F-18s figuratively roaring around us, we'll explore the benefits of establishing a core estate plan, gifting basics, and more. Ever wonder if Iceman would name Maverick as a successor trustee? Or who would inherit the hard deck? We did, so let's get right into it. Talk to me, Goose. Welcome to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film, brought to you by the Private Client Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. I'm Hans Young, a family wealth partner at Farella. Through this podcast, my guests and I will provide an entertaining look at family wealth and estate planning topics through well-known Hollywood movies. Each episode will focus on a single movie as we discuss fun facts, review our favorite scenes, and engage in thought-provoking discussions of real-world legal issues. And lastly, do you agree with our verdict? Is the movie a guilty pleasure or just not guilty? Again, welcome to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film. All right, so I'm super excited to have CJ Simonsen as my guest on the podcast today. CJ is a senior client strategist at BNY Mellon Wealth Management, where he leads a team in initiating relationships with individuals and families to grow and preserve their wealth through tax management and legacy planning. And perhaps most importantly for this episode, in a prior career, CJ was a Navy F-18 Super Hornet pilot. He retired after 24 years of service, including a 3-year tour as a Blue Angel pilot. He's completed 7 deployments around the world and 570 arrested landings on board multiple aircraft carriers. His total F-18 flight time is just shy of 3,000 hours. I mean, just an incredible bio. CJ, you are the closest I've come to meeting Tom Cruise in real life. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And Hans, we've had some history, you and I, just getting to know each other over the last year, working with clients together. So it's a real privilege for me to be here. I understand it's one of your first podcasts doing it in this manner, talking about movies. And so the fact that you came up and said, "Hey, let's do Maverick," I'm like, this sounds perfect, right up my alley. Absolutely. So I'm really excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've been, I think I came to you with this idea several months ago. So I'm so excited to do this. And in fact, this will determine whether this will be the first one released or not. We'll figure that out. But it is in fact our first recording of this podcast series. So again, welcome. And as you mentioned, we're talking about Top Gun Maverick today. I wanted to use this obviously based on your background, tying that in as a pilot. What we can do is explore some common estate planning issues that I think some of the characters might be encountering, or whether they know it or not. So let's jump right in. I would love at some point, this is where I would love to cue Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins. But hopefully at some point when the budget for this expands, we can do that. So we'll have to do it in our minds. But I want to jump in some fun facts about this movie, just kind of set the stage, set the tone for this film. So the movie opened in theaters May 27th, 2022. It was originally supposed to be released in 2019, but was delayed to 2021, I read, because of it was a bunch of complex action sequences, obviously, with the jets in the sky. And then because of the pandemic, Tom Cruise insisted it be delayed again until everyone could watch it in theaters rather than streaming it at home, which was kind of the trend during the early stages of the pandemic. And what a great call in hindsight, right? The movie has grossed now just shy of $1.5 billion worldwide. That makes it the second highest grossing film of 2022, the 12th highest grossing of all time. Number one is Avatar, by the way, at $2.9 billion, and the highest grossing film of Tom Cruise's career. I know when it released and it was announced, I had kind of no expectations. If anything, I had maybe low expectations just because how sequels go. I saw it in theaters immediately, loved it. I came home, and I think that night after seeing it in theaters, I bought it digitally. This is not something I do, especially in the streaming era. Most of us don't buy DVDs anymore. I can guarantee you, if I were still buying DVDs, this would have been a definite DVD purchase. Did you watch in the theater when it came out? Did you have any expectations? What were your thoughts?
I did. So I knew a lot of the people who kind of went in to help provide some consulting from the Navy for the movie. So I was really excited for the movie because I knew it was going to be a good movie based on what I'd heard from them. I saw it with my family in Minnesota. Actually, we were home from just going on our normal summer trip back to Minnesota. Saw it with my wife and my son. My daughter was a little too young still to watch it, but the three of us went, and for the first time in his life, after the movie, he's like, "Dad, you used to do that?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "I think I want to be a pilot." And I'm like, "Great." That's the point of this whole thing, right? Is to get kids excited about flying and possible military service in the future. So I saw it. I loved the first one too, but this one I feel like superseded. I just liked it a lot more, even though I love the first one as well.
Right. No, I feel the same. This one hits a little different, I think. And probably because we've had 38 years of nostalgia baked into this, and we've been waiting for this in a sense. A couple other fun facts I wanted to share, and I'll give you a chance to share as well. And this is just based on my internet research, right? The hard deck, which is Penny's bar, which is amazing. I love that scene, the scenes that take place in the bar. It doesn't really exist, but and you might know this better than I do, but it's based on the real life I bar on North Island. And apparently that's a real bar, and the way that they did change some of the decorations, but for the most part, I think based on what I read, it was based on that bar in real life. And the other thing I found was interesting, and I'm interested to hear your take on this as someone who's actually been in a jet going at these speeds. But Maverick, in one of the opening scenes or one of the first scenes where he flies the Dark Star, he's only supposed to get to Mach 9, and he gets to Mach 10, and he actually hits Mach 10.2 before the jet malfunctions and he has to eject. That means he was traveling roughly 7,826 miles per hour. Is this even possible?
Well, that is the answer is probably yes, because astronauts, the higher you get, the easier it is to go faster. I don't know in a normal non-space aircraft that we could get to Mach 10. I don't know the answer to that. So I'm not an expert in that regard, but I loved how he pushed it, right? It went to Mach 10 and then he's like, all right, I'm going to push it a little bit more, 10.1, 10.2. And then all of a sudden everything, as you know, goes dark and he ends up walking into a little diner in the middle of nowhere, right? In a spacesuit. So I don't know the answer to your question. It's probably possible at some point in time, but I don't know right now. I know the current aircraft that are flying cannot go Mach 10.
Yeah, and you mentioned his personality and his character of pushing it a little bit, and we'll come back to that when we discuss another issue later. But definitely, he's called Maverick for a reason. And then the Dark Star, again, another fun fact I found was just when it flies over Ed Harris's character in the beginning as he's defying his orders to land it, the roof of the shack, I think the little depot or shack next to Ed Harris, flies off. And that was a complete coincidence. It wasn't planned. And it worked out. I mean, it really showcased how powerful the jet really is. But that was completely unplanned, apparently.
Yeah, it was. And to add to that, I called my buddy Frank Weiser, who was actually flying the airplane that did that scene. He was Tom Cruise's pilot. Frank and I were on the team together on the Blue Angels in 2010, and we're still very, very close. So after our discussion yesterday, I called him like, hey, tell me about this. And he's like, well, actually, I did that in a Blue Angel jet, that scene. And the movie people, made the CGI Dark Star aircraft over the Blue Angel jet for that scene. And it's the normal number 6 launch, which we call a low transition, high performance climb, is the number 6 takeoff. So basically what happened is he launched, gets about 5 feet above the ground, gets his gear up, accelerates to 300 knots. And right at the guard shack, he pitches up to 60 degrees nose high. And that's when the roof actually comes off. And as you mentioned, it was not planned. And if you slow it down, you can actually see like the wires holding the roof down. And they weren't going to put it in because it looked so unbelievable that the director was like, we can't put this in because people aren't going to believe that this actually happened. But it actually happened. So yeah, I thought that was, like you mentioned, that was a very cool, unplanned thing that happened because of the power of that jet. And he said they probably did that scene 8 times. They practiced they did a couple with him pitching up right by the guard shack, and they did a couple of him just flying, very low overhead. So he said there was a stunt man in that guard shack because they wouldn't put a regular sentry, guard sentry in there. So that's pretty cool.
No, that's great. I love, by the way, that you're calling Tom Cruise's pilot for fun facts. I'm just going on Wikipedia from my couch. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Did you have a few fun facts? I think we were talking about you having a couple more to share.
Yeah. Well, the one that we talked about yesterday was the fact that the one that kind of connects the two movies in a very subtle way is Penny Benjamin, the girlfriend in this Maverick movie. If you recall, in the first one, when he was getting yelled at by the air boss for doing the flyby with Goose, they're at attention, getting yelled at. He was talking about getting put in hack, basically being grounded. One of the reasons was for doing a flyby of an admiral's daughter. And Goose leans over and he said, Penny Benjamin? So that's the only reference to Penny Benjamin in the first one, but she's a very big part in the second movie. So I thought that was neat. Another thing that in talking with Frank Weiser last night, I was like, hey, give me some fun facts because you were working on the movie. Let's bring some teeth into this podcast. So the first movie only had 2 flights. Tom Cruise got 2 flights in a F-14 Tomcat, very inexpensively made, right? So fast forward to this movie, 800 flight hours were recorded and were used and were paid for. And Paramount, who I think is it Paramount that made the movie, they paid $13,000 an hour. And so if you do the math, that's $10.4 million they paid the Navy for a 2.5-hour commercial, basically. But every single actor that you saw flying in Maverick got to fly in an airplane. Unlike in the first Top Gun, only Tom Cruise got to fly. Tom, since he's a pilot, as you know, maybe you didn't know, maybe people don't know, but he is a pilot. And I think that's his P-51 at the very last scene. That's Tom Cruise's airplane. So he wanted to make sure that everybody was able to get in the airplane and fly, because you can't act like you're under G. You can't act when you're doing a dive bomb or doing an air-to-air combat. It's very, very hard to do that in a 1G scenario, right? When you're not in an airplane. So they all actually started out flying in a Cessna airplane, all of the pilots or all the actors. Then they went to an Extra 300, which is an aerobatic airplane. Then they went to an L-39, which is the first jet they got to fly in before they got to fly in an F-18. So they were physically getting prepared for this, and they were all their basic own director when they were in the cockpit. So they would basically say action and hit go on the camera when the sun angle was correct for the aircraft. And as you know, Hollywood is very big on lighting. So it was either done early at dusk or, when the sun was rising or when the sun was setting, just so they had that nice golden sunshine. So the actors had to be very, very well versed on what direction they were heading, what scene they needed to film, and what they needed to do and say at that appropriate time. So I thought that was just a really neat piece of information that I got from Frank.
Yeah, that's great. I read the same thing, that essentially when they were in the air, the actors are doing all of their own filming, essentially, right? Because they don't direct, no one's in the cockpit with them as far as direction. And it would take, if they got something wrong, they'd come down because they'd have to wait for the entire flight to end. They'd land, and then the director and production crew would make adjustments, and they'd have to go right back up or go back up and do it again, which I got to imagine, again, presents its own challenges in not having immediate directions. That's awesome. Let's keep going. This is a category I want to do for all the movies we do on this podcast series, but I want to talk about our favorite scene. And it's tough. Gosh, this one is tough to pick one scene. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because we'll talk about, I guess we'll each pick our favorite scene, but I do want to mention some contenders or some runners up. I guess you're my guest. I'll let you start. What was your favorite scene? And I guess here, let me give you some options, I guess, before we jump into it, just kind of lay the groundwork. I had written down nearly the entire movie, honestly, but there's 8 scenes in particular. I'll run through them really quickly. There's Maverick's successful mission test run where he did it in 2 minutes and 15 seconds, where they had failed over and over. There's the dogfight football scene, which is essentially the newer version of, in the original Top Gun, the beach volleyball scene.
Yeah, that's my wife's favorite.
Yeah, that's right. There's the scene where Maverick meets with Iceman at his home. There's Mach 9 day in the Dark Star. That's one of the opening scenes. There's Maverick schooling all the young pilots in the initial training, where he basically they're dogfight training, and he gets every single one of them. They all do 200 plus push-ups each. There's the final battle, Maverick and Rooster versus 5th gen fighters. There's the pilot's attack on the actual uranium plant that they're training the entire time, but they're actually carrying it out. And then, of course, there's Rooster singing Great Balls of Fire at the hard deck. Nice callback to his father in Top Gun 1. So those are the scenes that I don't know if your favorite or your favorites fall into those, but those are the ones I'm working with.
Well, those are all great. And as I mentioned, my wife's favorite was the beach scene, as you can imagine. But I'm going to take a different one, and one that probably seems a little, Hollywoody, but it's when Maverick and Rooster stole the F-14 and escaped behind enemy lines to get back to the ship, because that actually really happened in real life in World War II. So that was kind of a model of something that happened in history. So back in November of 1944, a man by the name of Bruce Carr crashed in Czechoslovakia while he was doing some strafing runs very close to a Luftwaffe airport. And so he crash landed and he couldn't take off. So he was planning to just turn himself in to the Germans. And he spotted a couple of maintainers refueling an aircraft. And so he got an idea, hey, I'm gonna try and get this thing started and get out of here. So what he stole it's called a FW-190, and apparently a very hard aircraft to start. But he hopped in there and trial and error got the airplane started, took off, ended up flying to France and crash landing the airplane because I don't know if he couldn't figure out how to get the landing gear down or if he forgot. But he also, as he's taking off, it says that, or they say he flew in between like two hangars to get out of there, which is kind of like what they did when they took off out of, behind enemy lines in Maverick, where they clipped the nose gear going over that, that big building. So I think that, when I first saw that, I'm like, God, that's a kind of a Hollywood thing that would never happen. But when I was doing some research, I'm like, this actually did happen, which I think was pretty darn cool. Obviously Maverick had flown an F-14, and kind of neat that Rooster was in the back seat where, Goose, his dad, would have been. So I thought that scene was really, really neat.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And that's incredible insight into that scene. And I think what's interesting too is that I was going to mention that they're flying an F-14 in that one, which we should point out. But in the rest of the film, right, the Navy has moved on from the F-14, correct? So now they're typically flying the F-18. And then, of course, the jets that they're looking ahead at are the 5th gen fighters. And so that was neat to see how really the technology has progressed over the years as well.
Yep, just like you said. So the first one has F-14s, and the Navy stopped flying them in probably 2005, 6-ish. Actually, when I was getting out of flight school, the last F-14 pilots were my classmates from the Naval Academy. But they were about 2 months ahead of me in flight training. So the last of the F-14 pilots were slightly ahead of me. So I never had the opportunity. And now it's all F-18s and F-35, which is our, 5th gen fighter for the U.S. So maybe that's what Top Gun 3 is going to be about. I don't know.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. There is news has been released. I think they're in early stages of production, I think. But that's exciting. Yeah, no, that's amazing. My favorite scene, I had to think long and hard about this one, but I think it was Maverick's successful mission test run when he shows all the young pilots that it can be done, and can be done successfully, but he ups the ante by dropping the time from, I think, 2 minutes and 30 seconds down to 2 minutes and 15 seconds. And we just get to watch Tom Cruise be Tom Cruise. He's just doing his action hero stuff. And it was really amazing to see all the young pilots basically glued to the screen, right, as they're watching him in the simulation complete this run. So that was my favorite scene. I could watch that over and over. It gets me so amped. I would say a close second is that song, I Ain't Worried. I mean, by One Republic, when that drops on that dogfight football scene, yeah. I mean, I should start my day like that. You know what I mean? Just listening to that song and getting going. But that was probably my runner-up. Close was also when Maverick meets up with Iceman. I thought that was a really touching scene. I think made more emotionally impactful knowing that Val Kilmer, who plays Iceman, really was diagnosed with throat cancer in 2015, and that they sort of artfully worked that fact into the plot of the movie. I thought was really nice.
Along with that scene when Val Kilmer at the end was like, "Who's a better pilot?" And then Maverick is like,
"It's a nice moment." Yeah, let's not ruin it. Yeah, that was so great. Good. Let's move on. Let's get to kind of the heart of our discussion and talk through just a topic or a category I'm calling potential estate planning opportunities. So I want to take these characters in this movie and kind of explore some opportunities that they would have had, whether they knew it or not, to do some estate planning. And I think the one that, of course, probably most obvious and stuck out to me in watching this as many times as I have is Iceman's illness and ultimate death in this movie. We do find out that he dies in this movie. He's got throat cancer. He knows, I think in the small interaction that Maverick has with Iceman's wife, Sarah, when he arrives at their house, we know that Iceman doesn't have much time left. The cancer is spreading, it sounds like, and is progressing. I wanted to ask, or for us to explore, what should Iceman have done from an estate planning perspective, knowing that death is near and his time is limited? What should he have done to get his affairs in order? And it really highlights, I think, the importance of establishing just a core estate plan. What we are referring to when I say core estate plan, I want to run through some of those documents. And I think it starts with understanding what would have happened to Iceman and his estate if he didn't have a plan in place at all, if he did nothing. And I think we know and can safely say, California law would apply here. We don't even have to imagine that, because this movie takes place on North Island in Coronado on the San Diego Bay, subject to California law. So in California, there's something called probate administration, and that's true of many other states. But in California, basically what is probate? What would be avoided if Iceman were to put a plan in place? And then, since he has none, he would be subject to the probate administration process in the state, which is essentially just a court supervised process of administering a person's estate when they die. So this is very high level, not getting into the details, but it's where a court oversees this process to name an executor, who is the person that oversees someone's estate and also carries out, I was going to say plan, but this is where you haven't put a plan in place, but carries out the requirements under California law. Activities would include creating an inventory of that person's assets, having the assets appraised, paying off debts and creditors, and then ultimately distributing the assets to the beneficiaries. And the probate process in California may be unlike some other states, often viewed as something to avoid. It's generally time consuming. So even the most simple or straightforward probates often take 12 months or longer. So you're stuck in probate court for quite a while. It's public, which is not something I think everyone understands or realizes, that with some exceptions, most of the documents that are filed in probate court can be accessed by anyone in the public. Again, there are some exceptions to that, but a lot of these documents are public. And so if you're concerned about others viewing your matters and seeing how your estate is playing out, and some of the documents that are filed and the actions that are taken in court, this would not be the place to be, because it is public record. And then I think most importantly for most of us, there's a certain lack of control, because if you are subject to probate administration and you don't have a plan, you're going to be subject to what's called intestate succession. And these are laws under California that basically give a priority or an order of the estate administration, and it's governed by under the statute in the California Probate Code. And we don't have the time to go into all the details today, but just want to mention that it's going to depend on factors such as the decedent's marital status, whether they were married or not, whether they left surviving children or other relatives. And there's this order of succession that California law will dictate as to who will get the property, who will get someone's assets. And again, that leaves the decedent with less control, because these terms and the required distributions under intestate law may not be the actual distributions that this person actually wants to make. If you wanted to get out of this plan, this sort of default plan, there are some options, and we'll go into some of the documents now shortly about what constitutes a core estate plan. But I was going to ask you if you had anything to add to that.
Well, I wanted to ask you. So, I'm just thinking about, let's say Penny Benjamin owns that bar, and let's say she hadn't done anything, and all of this goes into probate. What happens to her business?
It would get passed as part of the residue of her estate. And again, these intestate succession laws would apply. In her case, I think we know she's unmarried, she's single. Her daughter, I think it's Amelia, who appears to still be a minor. So presumably assets would pass to her, but probably subject to some type of custodial account where assets would pass to her until she hits a certain age. I think it can go up to age 25, but usually the default is age 18. So again, Penny would be left, if she didn't have an estate plan, with sort of this default plan, but it may not be what she wants.
Yeah.
She's going to essentially leave this entire business to her daughter, who upon reaching age 18 will get access to these assets. And if she decides to sell it all off, and maybe she buys an even nicer, Penny drives that Porsche at the end. Maybe she buys the newest Porsche and decides not to do anything else with her money. That's all left as a possibility. Whereas again, if we run through some of what this core estate plan could entail, I think Penny would gain a lot more control over that if she wanted to.
Right. And she could have a real plan in place as far as succession. And maybe she doesn't want Amelia to have the bar when she's 18. And she can say, hey, Joe Smith or Maverick or someone will be in charge if and when I pass.
That would be interesting to have Maverick in charge of that. The hard deck. So turning back to, we're looking at Iceman's situation. What would he do if he had time and had advisors around him that would be recommending a basic estate plan? I think the sort of the centerpiece document of most plans in California would be a revocable living trust. I think we should start with what is a trust? What does it do? What is it ultimately? And it's pretty simple. It's a written agreement among three parties. So there's the trustor, often known as a settlor or the grantor. This is the person that creates the trust. So if in Iceman's situation, this would be Iceman. There's a trustee, and the trustee is generally responsible for overseeing the trust. So they manage and invest the trust assets on behalf of the beneficiaries. They are often they have discretion over distributions, depending on the terms of the trust as to when and for what purpose a beneficiary can withdraw assets. And I want to go, we'll dive into the trustee role a little bit more deeply later as well, but that's that second hat that someone could wear. And then lastly, there's the beneficiary themselves, someone who benefits from the trust, like who is this trust ultimately set up for? And while Iceman is living, it's we call it a revocable trust because he can revoke it at any point generally while he's alive and well. He would probably be wearing all three hats. He would be the trustor, and he always will be because he creates the trust. He would be the trustee, and he would name successors if he can't serve in that role. And then while he's living, again, presumably he would be the beneficiary, or perhaps he and his wife, Sarah, would be the beneficiaries. But that would be generally how that operates. And I'll stop there. And if you have anything to add on the living trust document.
Yeah, no. And I think what's also important is that you are also avoiding probate, which is what we just talked about, right? That's the biggest thing that a Rev Trust can do for you. So you are coming up with a plan. You have ultimate control of what's going to happen when you pass and not leaving it to the courts, the probate courts in California. So I think that is a huge benefit, and everyone who lives in California should have a Rev Trust. So, and I'm not an attorney, by the way, but this is just what I think from all of the clients that we have and all of the attorneys that I've talked to. That's the advice that I get.
Absolutely true. And revocable living trust is considered a non-probate transfer. So just by virtue of having assets titled in your trust when you pass will avoid probate. Again, one of the biggest considerations in putting a plan like that in place is to avoid probate. So you don't have to go through that process. A couple other points. It's private. So a trust administration, rather than being like a probate administration, it's not public. It's not court supervised. So really, it's the trustee carrying out these duties. And the trustee is free to hire advisors, attorneys, accountants, financial advisors to help them through that process. But ultimately, there's no one overseeing them in the sense that there's no public filings with respect to the administration itself. Now, there may be public filings when you're dealing with the assets and marshaling those and transferring title, but the overall process itself is private, which is very important. And as you mentioned, probably most important is it's just a control factor. The fact that the decedent in putting together this trust, right, Iceman can determine who gets what and who gets that lovely picture of Maverick and Iceman embracing at the end of Top Gun 1, which is sitting in black and white in Iceman's office. They cut to it a couple times. Who gets that? Who gets that? You can dictate whether it's tangible assets. Obviously, we mentioned in Penny's case, her actual business. All of that can be spelled out in very detailed terms in a revocable living trust in that agreement. Some of the other documents we should just round out and discuss just so we can establish, again, what a core estate plan generally entails. There's also usually a pour-over will. So this is a document that, because it's coupled with the living trust, it's called a pour-over because essentially what it'll do is any assets that are not titled in the trust on Iceman's death will just pour over into his will. It's not the same situation as if the will, there is a scenario where you can just have a will where all the terms of your plan are laid out in the will. Then it would just be a standalone will. It's not called a pour over will at that point. But the important thing to know there is that even if you just have a will in California, you still need to go through probate. So having a plan, quote unquote, doesn't itself get you out of probate. It's really having a living trust. And so if you have just a will, you're still going to have that will administered through the probate process. And again, here, if we were advising Iceman, we would say put together a trust first, and his will would at that point just be a pour over will that would essentially have a provision where all assets outside of the trust just get titled and treated as part of the trust upon his death.
That leads to a question in my head, which I know you can easily answer this question, but what happens then when he does pass? Who then becomes the trustee, and how does that work? Who would he name as successor trustee? Yeah,
presumably he would probably name, I would think, Sarah, his wife, as successor trustee. Before getting to this, I think we want to zoom out for a second and just say that, so a trustee, as we mentioned earlier, is in charge of overseeing the trust assets on behalf of the beneficiaries. They will carry out the terms of the trust. But importantly, the trustee owes a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries. And that essentially means that they have to put the interests of the beneficiaries as the most important objective. Under California law, a fiduciary duty is the highest legal standard that someone can have, or the highest standard of responsibility one can exercise. So it is a true responsibility. And so it shouldn't be taken lightly as far as who you select as your trustee. And so, yeah, it generally should be someone you trust. If it's going to be an individual, and we can talk about in a second, some other options there. But I would think he would probably name Sarah. I guess the question we should look at is, having established that a trustee should be responsible, has a great deal of responsibility over not just the assets of the trust, but in dealings with the beneficiaries. Is there any world where we can imagine Iceman naming Maverick as his successor?
There is a world. I mean, if he feels that Maverick, obviously, first and foremost, is trustworthy, would take, his wishes as grantor and put them towards the beneficiaries as he sees fit. But most importantly, does he think that Maverick has the skills and the legal acumen to be a trustee, which, as you mentioned, is not an easy task. It should not be taken lightheartedly. It's not an honor or a privilege to be a trustee. It is a lot of work. And I think it would have to be a serious conversation that Iceman would have with Maverick and with Sarah, because would Sarah feel comfortable having to go to Maverick for a distribution? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe not. Maybe she would be. Maybe she, in a lot of relationships, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but there's typically one spouse that takes care of the finances and one that doesn't take care of the finances. So when you become trustee, you have to make sure that you have absolute understanding and knowledge of what the assets are doing and where they're invested. And perhaps in this case, maybe Maverick isn't the best in that if he's not very fiscally responsible. And maybe Sarah is much better at that. I don't know the answer to that, but these are some conversations that Iceman would want to have before he makes that decision, for sure.
Absolutely. Quite frankly, I would find it hard to believe that Iceman, despite his love for him and his loyalty to Maverick, would ever name him as a successor trustee. I mean, and there's also the situation of maybe Sarah's named and until she passes, when the trust would presumably go and pass to Iceman's children, that Maverick could step in then.
Yeah.
But just knowing what we know about Maverick, and I think it calls back to, when we mentioned that, he hits Mach 10. Really, he should have stopped there because it would have kept the program going. But he pushes it to 10.1 and 10.2, and obviously the jet explodes after that. But if you take that in trustee context, I could just see him, right, making decisions where he's pushing the envelope. Again, a trustee would have full authority over the investments of the trust assets. And there are certain rules under California law. There's a prudent investor rule. There's sort of certain standards that a trustee needs to abide by in making investments. But again, I could just see Maverick going rogue against the advisors and just kind of pushing it. Maybe he bets it on some stunt in the air with another pilot, and all of a sudden trust assets are gone, or at least severely depleted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And they are such competitors in real life. Iceman might see this as Maverick getting the final say, right?
Exactly.
So there's no way he'll name him trustee, successor trustee.
Yeah, and just to round out our discussion about the other documents that a core estate plan would typically entail, we mentioned the revocable living trust. We mentioned a pour-over will. There's also what's called a durable power of attorney. This is a document that, unlike the will and the trust, which really are talking about assets and distributions and other terms that take effect when someone's actually passed and deceased, a durable power of attorney document allows someone to nominate an agent while they're still alive, but they're incapacitated. A common example of that would be maybe someone gets into an accident, is in a coma, and has now been declared by medical professionals to be incapacitated. They're incapable of making financial decisions for themselves. This document will allow you to name an agent to make those financial decisions on your behalf, essentially. So again, similar to a trustee role, the agent should be someone that you trust. Again, Iceman probably wouldn't name Maverick. One important distinction is that the power of attorney, unlike the trust document, it really handles and is intended to handle assets that are outside the trust. Because if you've placed assets into the trust and they're titled in the name of the trust, the trustee or your successor trustee would really make those calls and step into that role if you can't serve any longer. So if Iceman can't serve, then again, whether it's Sarah or Maverick or whoever else as a successor would step in. This power of attorney document is really intended for non-trust assets. Maybe there are retirement accounts or other assets that are, again, treated as non-probate transfers. So they don't have to typically be included as part of the trust. That would be what the agent is responsible for in this document.
Maybe it's a good time to also talk about some different options for a successor trustee other than a trusted friend, right? You've got someone that you trust or your spouse. Like in this case, we would assume that Sarah would be the successor trustee. But when she passes, then who's the successor trustee for that? So you could also name another friend, trusted individual, someone that you think can handle it, all the responsibilities that we've mentioned. There's a corporate fiduciary, which is someone like the bank that I work for, the Bank of New York, where we would step in and handle all of the asset management, handle the distributions, do all the tax returns that are required. In conjunction with that, someone can also name a co-trustee. So a lot of times we see at my employer, we will be co-trustee with, let's say, a spouse, because the spouse doesn't want to deal with the financial piece. They don't want to do the tax returns and all the really heavy lifting. And, oh, by the way, if there is a distribution where someone needs to be the bad guy, it's much easier for the corporate trustee to be the bad guy and say, look, this doesn't fall in with the wishes of the grantor. So we're sorry. The answer is no, you can't have $1 million to go on a venture with your friend. And then the third piece is a private fiduciary. So a professional private fiduciary, similar to a corporate trustee, although they won't do the investment management piece. They'll have a third party do the investment management piece. And a key difference between the two, a corporate fiduciary won't be the power of attorney and exercise things relating to like the health of anyone. We're not in the medical space, so we're not going to be dealing with any of that. Similarly, we won't do like required mandatory distributions from a 401k or anything like that. So corporate trustee is there basically to serve as trustee, not to do any of the external softer things that private professional fiduciary could handle. And we can work in conjunction with a private fiduciary as well. So we've done that before as well. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there just so that folks out there know that there are other options other than just people within someone's trusted circle. Absolutely.
As we're discussing the importance of selecting a trustee, I think there are maybe individuals out there who say, well, I don't have a trusted friend or family member, and who would I go to? And again, this is important to know. There are other options. Even where you do, I think there are situations, we've had client situations where it might make good sense to have a corporate trustee or a private professional fiduciary, either assisting as co-trustee or just serving entirely, despite the fact that there might be a trusted individual in the family or a friend, because there's expertise that they may not have. Despite the fact that you love and trust them. Calling back to the discussion about the power of attorney, the other document in the core estate plan generally is the advanced healthcare directive. So this is similar to the document we talked about for your financial affairs, but this really relates to you're nominating an agent to make healthcare decisions for you in the event that you can't, again, because you're alive but incapacitated. The last two documents are often included. Usually there's some instrument, whether it's in the will or maybe it's a standalone document for those with minor children. I don't think in Iceman's case his children are minors anymore, but assuming they are, he would probably want to nominate guardians for them. And you do that by having this nomination of guardian document, or again, it's done in the will itself. Again, it would seem as though he would nominate Sarah as the other parent first. Again, I find it hard to believe that he would nominate Maverick as guardian, given that they live in that beautiful house. It would probably benefit Maverick, quite frankly.
Yeah, right.
I mean, he would move out of that out of that airplane hangar, which admittedly is amazing. I would love to have that, although being out in the desert and having seemingly no AC doesn't sound great.
No,
but it would benefit Maverick to probably as guardian. He might get an ancillary benefit of moving into Iceman's house if Sarah's not around anymore. But yeah, he would be able to do that through that document. And then the last one, of course, is I mentioned when you establish the trust, and I often tell clients it's like when you sign the trust agreement, an imaginary box comes to life that it contains all your instructions as to what should happen when you pass, but you still have to physically take the act. You have to physically put assets into the box. That process is retitling assets. So if you got a bank account or if you have real estate, really, in order to do it right, those assets should really have the name of the trust on some type of official titling document. This general assignment, this last document I'm referring to, basically says I give everything I have, all of my assets, whether tangible or intangible, I give it and put it in the name of the trust. But that's considered to document your intention. It's really intended to be a fallback document. I mean, really the first and foremost step should be actually retitle assets. But that rounds out your core estate plan. And I think, as we've discussed, Iceman would be great in preparing that and putting that together.
You're absolutely right. So I think hopefully Iceman did do an appropriate plan, and he has everything in order, because obviously when you know that you're going to pass, or we're all going to die, right? Nobody lives forever. So I think it's prudent for everyone to do this and have that discussion with your spouse. And if you think it's prudent, have the discussion with your kids. And, having family meetings is very, very difficult, especially if there's a lot of money involved. But if you have a company like, a BNY Mellon, where we can step in and kind of help facilitate those meetings, I know that helps a lot. And I know you do that as well, Hans, within your purview. I'm sure you do a lot of family meetings and help bring these difficult discussions to the forefront.
And we'll cover this, I think, pretty briefly. But the other potential planning opportunity that I identified was, so Maverick is clearly, he's still guilty. I mean, literally 38 years have passed since Top Gun 1. We know that Goose dies at the end. And although they make it very clear that Maverick was cleared of any wrongdoing in that accident, he feels guilt-ridden over it. And I should say, I was almost going to give a spoiler alert that Goose died, but Top Gun 1 came out in 1986. It's been 38 years. I mean, goodness gracious, if someone hasn't seen that yet and this moment is what spoiled it for them, I had a couple other spoilers that I wanted to give them for whoever's out there where this was actually a spoiler for decades old movies. In Star Wars Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. And in The Sixth Sense, Bruce Willis's character is dead throughout the entire movie. Yeah, so we got that out of the way. For anyone who is still waiting to watch Top Gun 1 since 1986, that was for you. And so Maverick, obviously guilty over his death. It's very clear throughout this movie. And also because of it, him wanting to protect Rooster, who is Goose's son, played by Miles Teller, I think pulls his papers from the Naval Academy, we find out, and it sets Rooster back 4 years. And so I wanted to think about, what are some other things, Maverick could have done to benefit Rooster, other than sort of being a shadow father for him and not doing a great job at it, by the way. So I want to talk about, just really briefly here, there are lifetime gifts that Maverick could have made. So under federal law, currently, everybody has a $13.61 million lifetime estate and gift tax exemption. Whatever you don't use during your life as a lifetime gift will be used at your death. If you use, $2 million of that as a gift and you report that to the IRS during your life, you'll reduce the amount of exemption at your death by $2 million. So pretty straightforward there. So basically, if someone passes and their assets are in excess of that number, then it's a 40% estate tax rate that you have to pay to the IRS. it's important to note that under current law, it will sunset that $13.61 million number if nothing else happens and Congress doesn't take any additional action. That number is going to sunset and roughly be cut in half. Not quite, but it's probably projected to be about seven or so $million. So people will be losing a lot of estate and gift tax exemption. So Maverick has that. He's got that capability. He also has what all of us have, which is a $18,000 annual exclusion. This is the amount that you can gift to somebody, and it's per person per year. So Maverick could give Rooster $18,000 on December 31st. And then on January 1st of the next year, give him another $18,000. And this is not counted against his lifetime gift exemption. So this is just a gift that he can make to anybody, as many people as he wants every single year. And again, importantly, it doesn't reduce his lifetime gift tax exemption, which when you're using that $13.61 million exemption, you actually have to file a gift tax return to the IRS. Whereas again, the $18,000 exclusion, with some exceptions, if you're just making those types of gifts throughout the year, you're not needing to file a gift tax return. And so that's the simple thing that Maverick could have done, I think, is just rather than trying to coach him or pull his papers, maybe he should have just provided some funding to Rooster.
Yeah, I agree. That seems like a pretty harsh move if you've been accepted to the Naval Academy, which is not easy to do. And then the person who your father trusted to fly you around safely, who, eventually was in the airplane where your father died, pulls the papers at the Naval Academy, I would be very, very disappointed, to say the least. Backing up, I went to the Naval Academy, so I know how special that place is and how challenging it is to get in there. So I totally understand where Goose is coming from. I'm sorry, where Rooster's coming from. And, a little monetary forgiveness probably would go a long way, right? Like, hey,
absolutely.
Please, that's something that Maverick absolutely should do.
Yeah. And we'll get into this. I plan to get into these, some of the different vehicles or options for Maverick if he wanted to make a gift, because it doesn't have to be an outright gift. I think it's important to point out he could have established a trust for Rooster's benefit. There's several different ways this could have gone, but I think the important thing too, maybe the fact that we know Maverick's credit card gets declined at the hard deck in the beginning of the movie. So, I mean, we say Maverick should have done this and made gifts to Rooster. I think the bottom line is I don't think he had the funds or the assets to do it. This is probably moot anyway, but I want to at least cover some of those gifting basics there. And let's get now, I want to talk about just really quickly here, this category of, did they get it right? Did the movie get it right? And in particular, you having your experience in the Navy and as a Blue Angel pilot, you've got a unique view on this movie because you've done a lot of the things that Maverick and the other pilots are doing. I just wanted to give a chance for you to tell listeners and tell me, quite frankly, did the movie get it right? Are there details that really stuck out to you that were, just completely inaccurate or embellished, or maybe they did get it right? I know Tom Cruise, I've read that he put a lot of time into this and trying to get all the details just right. So maybe there's not, and they did get it right.
So they got 99.9% of it right. It was a phenomenally well produced, well filmed, well acted movie. And the flying parts, it's all real. Like I said, they flew 800 hours in a Hornet, all with either a Blue Angel in the front or a Top Gun instructor in the front. There were multiple Top Gun instructors. The one scene, or there were a couple times where it wouldn't happen in real life, was when Maverick is hanging out below two of the students as they're flying right before they get ready to start the air-to-air BFM, basic fighter maneuvers, and he splits the two aircraft and the two planes, one rolls right, one rolls left. That would never happen. That is way inside of our safety bubble. We have a 500-foot safety bubble around every airplane. So that would never happen. Very cool for the movie, though. Secondly, another thing that wouldn't happen was when he and Rooster were doing initially he started up upside down, which that wouldn't happen, but that's still very cool. Now, by the way, that maneuver is a maneuver that we do in the Blue Angels. It's called the Fortis. And so Frank, who was flying the airplane that was upside down, he said last night when I talked to him, he said, yeah, that's basically the Fortis, except my gear is up instead of down. You went to the Blue Angel show, Hans, so you remember when they had the gear up or gear down and one was upside down, one was...
I do.
correctly positioned. So it was that maneuver. And then Pops Papiano was in the other airplane, and he just basically slid underneath Frank, who was upside down. And then Rooster and Maverick started that downward spiral fight way down below the hard deck. So the hard deck was 5,000 feet, which is typical. And they both, as you saw in the movie, go behind the mountains, and they probably scooped it out at a couple hundred feet. That would be an absolute no-no. Unless it was in combat situation where you're fighting someone for your life, that would happen, but not in a training scenario. So other than those two things, I mean, the low-level flying was absolutely spot on. I've flown those low-level routes hundreds, if not, multiple hundreds of times. So it was just very nostalgic for me to watch. And the bombing runs, like the circular bombing targets, I've done that a million times. So it was really fun as a former F-18 pilot to watch this movie and to know that they really did it right. I mean, it was a phenomenally, it's just very, very well done.
That's so great to hear, because I wouldn't have known any of this, but it looked real. Yeah. And I'm glad to hear that it actually did do it justice. And finally, I'm going to do this with all my guests in this series, but give me your verdict. So the verdict for the movie would be, is it guilty or not guilty? And really by guilty, I mean guilty pleasure. So if you say it's guilty, you enjoyed the movie, but feel guilty about it for any reason. If it's not guilty, you either disliked the movie or loved it, so it cannot possibly be a guilty pleasure. I think for me, it was 100% not guilty. I love this movie. As I mentioned, I immediately bought it, and I've probably seen it, 8 to 10 times since. I thought it was incredible. And quite frankly, where it was in the point of time when it was released, and we were all just kind of coming out of the pandemic, and seeing that in the theaters, that was one of the first movies, if not the first movie I saw. It was incredible. And and meeting you has made that experience has made this movie even more incredible, in the sense that now I've got personal insight from you into the behind the scenes and just your experiences. So I thought it was great. What was your verdict?
I absolutely agree. I am 100% not guilty. I love the movie. I've seen it just as many times as you. I force my kids to watch it, and hopefully it inspires them to do something great with their lives. They don't have to join the military or be a pilot, but hopefully, it inspires them to do something great. As a former Navy pilot, it's just really, it just kind of warms your heart that they were able to get it done so well as they did. So I feel bad for the Air Force guys, because they don't really have any good movies. They've got, Iron Eagle 1 through 8 or whatever it is, and none of those are good. So
So as we're wrapping up today, what we've learned is that even if your call sign is Iceman, you're the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and you're best friends with Maverick, you can still benefit from establishing a core estate plan. And you should be mindful when choosing your successor trustees, who ultimately play a critical role in carrying out your plan. CJ, thank you so much for joining me today. I had a blast. I know as we mentioned, there are plans for a Top Gun 3, so maybe we do this again.
Yeah, I'm all for it. And, thank you so much for having me, Hans. Really, really appreciated this conversation. And hopefully the listeners out there enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm Hans Young with my guest, CJ Simonsen from BNY Mellon Wealth Management. You've been listening to The Verdict, Estate Planning Through Film, brought to you by the Private Client Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. Thanks so much for joining us, and keep watching movies.